She was too shy to be chosen until the right man didn't need words. A quiet woman's journey to be seen. They say it's the young who fall in love fast, but only those with years behind them truly understand what it means to be unseen, passed over, returned, or simply forgotten. Clara Boone was 43 years old the day she arrived in Dust Creek with a stitch bonnet, a single suitcase, and her heart trembling inside her chest. She had followed the promise of a letter, a mail-order bride arrangement, sent in haste by a man who later found her too quiet to live with. No spark, he claimed, no fire, just silence. He sent her back before she even unpacked. For a woman in her 40s, no longer the blushing bride type, with time and disappointment etched into the corners of her eyes, rejection hits different. It isn't just heartbreak, it's shame. It's that bone-deep ache of knowing the world sees you as too much of something, or worse, not enough. Clara had always believed her quiet nature was something to be endured, not loved. She wasn't lively, flirtatious, or full of charm. She had no clever stories, no radiant laugh. But she listened deeply. She understood pain without it needing to be spoken. Yet in a world that rewards noise, Clara's silence was her sentence. And so in the middle of her life, not quite young, not yet old, she stood alone on the train platform once more. Forgotten luggage, forgotten woman. What she didn't know was that someone else was watching. A man who understood what it meant to be left behind by the world. A man who couldn't hear the noise others demanded, but could read a soul through the way it moved. Eli Kerrigan was a rugged settler with weathered hands and a deaf ear to gossip and cruelty alike. And the first time he saw Clara standing small, shamed, and overlooked, he didn't hear her voice. But he saw her, truly saw her. This is not a story of dramatic rescues or fairy tale kisses. It is a story of stillness, of quiet women, of second chances, and of the kind of love that speaks in glances, not words. Because sometimes what the world dismisses as too quiet is exactly what someone else has been listening for their entire life. They told her she was too quiet to be loved, that no man would waste a letter, a meal, or a marriage on a girl who never raised her eyes, never made demands, never fought for her own place at the table. Her name was Clara Boone, 27, a mail-order bride from Illinois sent westward like a parcel tied in ribbon and obligation. The town she left behind had long since decided she was invisible. A shadow in church pews, a helper in the back kitchen, a soul so quiet her own voice sometimes startled her. But Clara had loved once, quietly, deeply, the kind of love that writes letters long after the sender stops answering, the kind that dreams through cracked windows and hushes tears into her pillow. And it was that flicker of longing, not desperation, that made her reply to an ad clipped from a Missouri newspaper. Widower seeks respectable Christian wife. Must be of decent health, capable of keeping house. Kind disposition preferred. Forward responses to Mr. Ezra Middleton, Frontier Ridge WI. Her aunt said she was being foolish, that men wanted wives who could flirt, not whisper, that Clara's softness was a handicap. But Clara didn't see herself as broken, only overlooked. So she wrote, neatly, prayerfully, truthfully. She told Mr. Middleton that she didn't speak much in crowds but loved to read scripture aloud to children, that she kept house for her sick mother for 5 years and knew how to tend wounds, boil stew, and sew by lamplight, that she didn't dance or sing but she listened well and never turned away from sorrow. Weeks passed. Then one morning, wrapped in brown paper, a letter came addressed in a strong, slanted hand. Miss Boone, I appreciate your honesty. I don't need a chatterbox, just a good woman who won't run when life turns hard. If you're willing, the train stops at Frontier Ridge the first Monday of each month. I'll be there. Look for a man with a leather vest and gray hat. Ezra M. Clara packed with care. Her mother's brooch, a Bible bound in green velvet, and 3 dresses, none fashionable but clean. She sat on that train with hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at landscapes growing wilder and colder with every mile. And when she stepped onto the dust-blown platform of Frontier Ridge, she saw him. Tall, weather-worn, holding a sign that read Clara. He looked her over once, then twice, and said, "You didn't mention you were so quiet." She tried to smile. "I thought I had." He frowned. A long, low sigh left his chest. "I need someone who can fill the house with something. A voice. Laughter. I've got too much silence already." Clara swallowed hard. "I can try." But it was too late. He looked past her, waved off the station master, muttered something about needing someone more lively. then turned and walked away, leaving Clara Boone standing alone, dust clinging to her skirt, shame creeping up her spine like fire. She didn't cry, not there, not in front of strangers. But that night at the town's empty inn, she wept into the borrowed pillow. Not because she'd been rejected, she was used to that, but because once again someone had mistaken her gentleness for absence. Clara Boone stayed in Frontier Ridge only because she had nowhere else to go. Her return ticket had been paid for by a cousin who'd since passed on, and the boarding house matron, Mrs. Wickham, a widow with a brisk mouth but a warm heart, took pity on her. For the first week, Clara swept the steps, helped cook stew, and avoided the questioning eyes of strangers. Her presence in the small Wyoming town was an echo, not a shout, noticed only when the light caught her hair in a certain way, or when the church pianist fell ill and Clara quietly took her place, her fingers trembling over the keys as if afraid of the music she might let loose. People whispered, the rejected bride they called her, the quiet one, the one he sent away. But on the 8th morning something changed. The town's general store was run by a man named Eli Kerrigan. Not much was known about him except that he had fought in the war, gone deaf from a blast, and returned to buy the store with a soldier's pension and a scar running from ear to jaw. He was tall, broad, with steady hands and unreadable eyes. Most folks left him alone. He couldn't hear after all, and didn't speak unless needed. But he watched. He always watched. And that morning he saw Clara. She was buying thread and matches, speaking softly to the clerk who barely acknowledged her. Clara stood there waiting patiently as the clerk helped two louder women behind her first. She didn't complain. She simply held her small basket in both hands, like a prayer, and when it was finally her turn, she offered a gentle thank you that went unheard. But not by Eli. He stepped from behind the flour sacks and approached. His hands signed something Clara didn't understand, but the way he offered her a folded note said everything. I saw what happened. You shouldn't be invisible. She blinked, stunned. Her fingers curled around the paper as if it might vanish. You don't have to speak loud to be worth hearing. Clara didn't know what to say, but for the first time in days, her shoulders relaxed. Over the next week, Eli kept showing up, not intrusively, but like someone who saw where the cracks were and wanted to seal them without making a fuss. He'd leave fresh apples on the boarding house step, slip notes into the prayer books. Once he sat beside her after Sunday service, close enough to read her lips as she whispered a quiet hymn to herself. He never asked questions, never forced her to speak louder, be brighter, or take up more space than she was ready to. And that silence, that honoring of silence, felt more loving than any words ever had. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed first. You've got a shadow, girl, she said, peering out the window. That Kerrigan boy watches you like a man who's finally seen something worth waiting for. Clara blushed. He's just kind, that's all. But inside, a warmth had begun to bloom. Not the blazing fire of sudden romance, but the low, steady glow of being seen, heard, understood. Eli invited her to help sort books in the back room of the store one Thursday morning. She said yes without knowing why. As they worked side by side, he handed her another folded note. You don't need to try to be someone else. You already have more strength in your silence than most folks have in a lifetime of noise. She looked up at him. Her lips parted, but no words came. Just the kind of smile that trembles before it blooms. And in that moment, Clara Boone felt something she hadn't felt in years. Even as Eli Kerrigan's quiet gestures became Clara's daily comfort, something within her resisted. A fragile voice in the back of her mind whispered that this too could be a mistake, that perhaps her softness, long mocked, long punished, would eventually be her undoing again. Clara knew how to read people even without speaking much, and while Eli didn't speak at all, his eyes were fluent in emotion. He was patient, steady, unafraid of silence. But what scared her more than his presence was the way she wanted to lean into it. She had grown used to being the one who was overlooked, invisible. She had spent her entire life apologizing for being too quiet, too big, too unsure. The only man who'd ever promised to marry her had turned cold the moment he saw her step off the train. You don't look like your letters, he said. You're not what I expected. And with that, she was sent back like a package refused. The shame had carved itself deep into her bones. So when Eli smiled at her the next day and held out a piece of apple pie he'd baked himself, Clara's fingers trembled as she accepted it. Her heart ached not because she didn't want it, but because she did. What if he saw her the way the others did? What if all this kindness was just pity? Later that night, she sat alone in her small room under the eaves of the boarding house reading his latest note. People often confuse quiet with emptiness. But I've watched you. You notice everything. You care. You hold space like a lantern. That's not weakness, it's grace. She traced the words with her finger, trying to let herself believe them. The next day, while helping organize supplies in the store, Clara tried to express something. She picked up a pencil and with hesitant hands wrote, "Why me?" Eli read the words and didn't answer immediately. Then he took her hand, not impassioned but with gentle certainty, and turned it over. In her palm, he wrote with his finger, "Because I've been waiting for someone who listens with her soul." Tears welled in her eyes. But the old voice came roaring back days later when she overheard two women at the general store gossiping near the barrels. "I hear she was sent back like an unwanted coat," one sneered. "And now Kerrigan's sniffing around her like some lost pup. She'll ruin him." Clara froze. It didn't matter that Eli couldn't hear their cruelty. She heard it enough for both of them. That night she returned every note he had given her into a small bundle and left it on his doorstep with one final scrap. "I'm afraid of being someone's burden." She didn't sleep that night. In the morning she found an envelope outside her door. Inside was a simple sketch, a tree with its roots tangled around a broken fence still growing despite the damage. Beneath it he had written, "You're not a burden, you're a beginning." Clara broke. Not loudly, not visibly, but in the sacred, terrifying way that soft people do by finally admitting they want to be loved. Safe. The next morning, the town of Dust Creek was veiled in a soft, pale fog. It clung to the rooftops and kissed the earth as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clara stood by her window, the letter from Eli resting in her hand. The sketch burned into her mind. "You're not a burden, you're a beginning." The words wouldn't leave her, not because they were sweet, but because they were brave. No one had ever said such a thing to her, not even her parents. Her life had been shaped by caution and compliance, not by courage. But that morning something stirred in Clara Boone. A resolve not loud or fiery, but quiet and firm, like the roots of a tree beneath hard soil. She walked through the mist boots, pressing into the damp earth, and made her way to Kerrigan's homestead. No one saw her pass. No words rehearsed themselves in her mind. She simply walked until she arrived at his porch, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Eli opened the door before she knocked. He must have seen her through the window. His eyes, clear, still waiting, met hers with a depth that unraveled every knot in her chest. Without hesitation, Clara handed him a small folded note. Her hands trembled slightly. He opened it. "I don't know how to speak my worth, but maybe I can live it." Eli didn't try to answer with his hands or paper. He simply stepped forward and held her not as a prize or possession, but as a person who had finally dared to stand fully in her own truth. That afternoon, they rode into town together in silence. He bought her a new pair of leather gloves, deep brown lined with lamb's wool, saying nothing, only slipping them gently onto her hands. They sat by the lake later that evening, the sun lowering itself into the hills while she traced the ridges of his palm with her finger. He smiled. For the first time, Clara smiled back without lowering her gaze. In the days that followed, she stopped flinching at the whispers. She still heard them, but they no longer anchored her. Something had shifted. Perhaps it was Eli's steady presence. Perhaps it was the dignity she had begun to build from within. She volunteered at the mission kitchen, helped repair the school roof, and began writing letters for neighbors who couldn't read or write. Her quietness became service. Her service became strength. The town began to notice. Not all approved, but some softened. Even the postmaster's wife, who once looked past Clara as if she were part of the furniture, now greeted her with a nod. One Sunday after church, as she stood outside the chapel in a pale green dress, she had sewn herself a small girl, tugged at her skirt, and said, "You're the lady who writes letters for people, right?" Clara knelt. "Yes, ma'am. Can you help me write one to my papa in heaven?" Clara's throat closed, but she smiled through it. "Of course." Later that evening, Eli brought her a note again. "The loudest voice in town still can't quiet the love you've given." This time she wrote back, "I want to speak a love with my life like you do." Winter came softly that year like a sigh from the heavens. Snow dusted the rooftops of Dust Creek, blanketing the hard earth in a hush that matched Clara Boone's quiet world. But something had changed in her silence, no longer a cage. It had become a sanctuary. The woman once whispered about in parlors and behind church pews now walked with steady purpose, and when she smiled, it came from somewhere deeper than before. Clara had not just been seen, she had been chosen. And Eli Kerrigan, the man who never heard a sound, understood her more than any man ever had. Theirs was not a romance of grand gestures or declarations shouted into the wind. It was built of small things, shared glances across rooms, hands brushing near hearths, notes tucked into work gloves, laughter felt rather than heard. One evening as snow flurried outside the schoolhouse window, Clara was helping children write letters to St. Nicholas. Eli arrived early, standing quietly near the doorway. The children adored him, especially those who, like him, lived with ears that heard nothing and hearts that felt everything. He held out his hand to her when class ended. No note this time, just a gesture. She took it and they walked to the lake now, frozen at its edges. He handed her a folded piece of paper ink, smudged slightly from his rough fingers. You've given me a world I never thought I'd live in, one, where silence means safety, not shame. Would you build the rest of it with me? There was no ring, just the question. And Clara, with eyes full of tears and wonder, answered the way she always had, quietly, truly, with a single nod. They married in the spring. Not everyone came. Not everyone approved. But those who mattered stood beneath the wildflowers and wind watching as Eli took Clara's hands in his and promised to always listen without needing to hear. She wore a simple dress made with her own hands. No veil, no makeup, just Clara whole at last. The pastor paused before pronouncing them husband and wife, then said with a chuckle, I usually ask the bride to speak now, but I reckon she already has every day with the way she lives. Laughter rose gently through the air, and as they kissed, even the wind seemed to still in reverence. Afterward, they didn't travel far. They simply walked home hand in hand along the dirt road that led to a life they had made real through kindness, resilience, and unspoken love. Neighbors dropped off pies and blankets. Children made cards. One older woman whispered, that shy girl, she's braver than most of us put together. Clara Boone, once rejected for being too quiet, had become the voice of something eternal. That love in its purest form doesn't need noise. It only needs truth. The sun rose gently over Dust Creek, casting its amber glow across the Kerrigan homestead, a modest place but strong in its bones, much like the woman who now tended it. Clara Boone, once a mail-order bride cast aside for being too shy, was no longer a shadow in her own story. She stood beneath the porch awning, watching Eli chop firewood in the early morning chill steam, rising from his breath, his movements sure and unhurried. He turned and caught her gaze and smiled. That smile had become her home. In the quiet months that followed their wedding, Clara began to blossom, not by changing who she was, but by leaning deeper into her truth. She didn't become louder. She didn't learn to charm or entertain. She remained herself, gentle, watchful, thoughtful. But the difference was this time, no one asked her to apologize for it. Eli had built her a small sewing nook by the window, where sunlight streamed in each afternoon. There she made quilts for the orphanage and warm coats for children whose families struggled through the winter. She took slow walks with Eli through the woods behind the house, where they learned each other's rhythms without words. He showed her how to feel the shift of a storm in the way trees moved. She taught him how to read hearts without reading lips. They had created their own language, built not with sound but with tenderness. Sometimes in town, people would still look at Clara with a mix of curiosity and pity. That's the quiet girl, they'd whisper. The one who was rejected. But slowly that tone changed. That's the woman who teaches the deaf children. That's the one who never gossips, never boasts, but always shows up. That's the one Eli Kerrigan married, and did you hear how happy he looks now? Clara never needed to say much. Her life spoke volumes. One spring morning, a knock came at the door. A stranger, nervous, red-eyed, stood with a young girl by her side. The woman's voice trembled. She's shy. They say she don't talk much. Folks tell me something's wrong with her. But I heard what you've done here, and I wondered if maybe she'd be safe here. Clara knelt in front of the girl. Their eyes met, and for a long moment nothing was said. Then Clara reached for the girl's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. That's how it began. By summer, their home was a haven, not just for themselves, but for others too quiet for the world to understand. A place where no one had to shout to be heard, where being too shy meant you had the gift of listening. And for Clara, every time she looked across the table and saw Eli smiling at her, every note he wrote, every silent laugh they shared, she was reminded of this. The world had once told her she was too little, but love had shown her she was just enough. The wind in Dust Creek often carried stories. It swept over hills and through open doors, whispering the names of those forgotten and those remembered. Among the stories, one began to take root, not because it was loud, but because it lingered in the hearts of those who heard it. It was the story of a woman once called too shy and a man who never needed noise to understand the truth. Clara Boone's name became known not in taverns or on wanted posters, but around tables where mothers spoke to daughters. They spoke of her not as a heroine of spectacle, but of courage, the kind that blossoms slowly and holds firm. She was the quiet one, people would say, the one who was sent back unwanted. And still, she built a home, a life of love. She didn't have to fight to be seen, someone just had to open their eyes. There's a power in that kind of story, the kind that slips beneath your skin without effort. Clara never sought revenge or proved her worth by becoming someone else. Instead, she triumphed by simply being herself in a world that tried to shame her for it. Her victory wasn't a wedding in front of a crowd or a fist slammed down in defiance. It was found in the slow unfolding of a woman who had once been overlooked and in the man who chose her because of her silence, not despite it. For Eli Kerrigan, loving Clara had changed him too. He'd grown up in a world where strength was measured in labor and noise. But Clara taught him that there is a fiercer power in gentleness, a deeper strength in restraint. And as he watched her move through each day, tending the garden, comforting a lost child, praying by candlelight, he knew she was the bravest soul he had ever known. Years passed, and the Kerrigan homestead grew not in size but in meaning. It became a resting place for the weary, a refuge for the unheard. Deaf children learned to sign at the kitchen table. Abandoned women found work mending clothes beside Clara. Travelers heard about the home where silence heals, and they came not for shelter alone, but to be reminded that they were enough. Clara never forgot the letter that had nearly ended her story, the rejection that had told her she was too much and too little all at once. Now that letter sat folded in her desk untouched for years, not as a scar but as a reminder, a symbol of where she began and how far she'd come. Sometimes she would take it out and read it, not with sorrow, but with a quiet pride. Then she would slip it away and walk back out to the porch where Eli waited, tapping the rhythm of their shared song on the armrest. Together they would sit and watch the wind carry the stories of others, and Clara's heart would whisper the truth that had saved her. I was never too shy. I was simply waiting to be heard. In a world that often celebrates loud voices and bold personalities, stories like Clara's remind us that quiet strength is just as powerful. Too often, women, especially in their later years, are told they're too much or not enough, too shy, too soft, too set in their ways. But this story reveals a deeper truth. Real love doesn't demand performance. It notices the soul behind the silence. Clara's journey shows us that rejection is not the end, but sometimes the beginning of being truly seen. When we reach a certain age, it can feel like chances are fewer and our stories are finished. But life, like the wild frontier, has a way of surprising us if we dare to keep our hearts open. Let this be a gentle reminder to everyone watching: your voice, no matter how soft, is worthy. Your worth is not defined by how others fail to recognize it. And love in its truest form is patient enough to wait until you are ready to be found. If this story moved you, if it stirred a memory, a hope, or a quiet tear, please consider subscribing to None, Wild West Saga. Share this video with someone who may need reminding that it's never too late, and leave a comment below. What moment in your life taught you the value of being truly seen? Your story matters. And here in this quiet corner of the Wild West, we honor every word of it.